thank you all for coming. I'm Jonathan Finkelstein. I'm the CEO of Credly. And about 2 years ago at this very event, I was giving a talk about the labor market's currency has focused on a $10,000 bill, a denomination of currency that we call the degree. And yet there are signs that there are alternative forms of credentials, newer denominations that allow the labor market to transact in new ways. Sellers, people with knowledge and skills and abilities, and buyers, companies, organizations, those who can offer new pathways to people based on those skills. I was having this conversation with Deb Quazzo, and she said there seems to be a lot of activity around liquidity, skill liquidity, people being able to transact more readily with new forms of currency in this labor market. And she said, I think it would be nice to get a group of people together who are living this every day and actually building the future around this new way of thinking about how skills can better connect jobs to people who can actually fill those jobs with just the right sets of skills. So the panel we have here today represent groups that are providing translation services, if you will, between the different groups within the labor market, those who are forming new kinds of partnerships that I think represent the future of the way education is both being disaggregated and then rebundled in new kinds of ways. And we wanted to challenge them and challenge us to think about what we should each be thinking about when we think about what it's going to look like 2 years from now when the next panel assembles to talk about the progress that was made. So, a lot of times at these events, people will say, "Hey, are there any employers in the room?" And then they all get, shocked and dismayed that at events like this there aren't enough employers in the room. So I thought we would start with, well, we're all employers to the extent that you've hired anyone, so we should all think of ourselves that way. But we have one real true employer on the panel who's been in a business for about 200 years. Not Mark personally.
Good job, Mark.
But Mark's been innovating from within. Mark, I'm wondering if you could tell us about the new skill economy you've created inside the Hartford. Why have you created a new form of skill currency, and how did you do it?
So let me kick it off with a question. So you all went through 4 years of college, probably, right? And you all know how to read. But do you know how to read a cybersecurity agreement with a corporation? Or do you know how to read a general liability insurance policy? Have you ever tried that? It's sad, it's sad, but my life in learning at in the insurance industry has been, how do I ensure that once I get that person into my company, that I have some assurities that those skill sets are there. So that's one of the skill sets. Another one is once I've read it and I think I've understood it, can I talk to a customer who's really stressed out because his ceiling just caved in or he had an employee fall in the middle of the floor, and now I have to determine, is this policy going to apply in the right way for that customer? And once I'm pretty sure he can do it, I want to make sure that I can identify him. And then, I can go down the list of, once he's done that, can he get the data in our platform so that when that happens again, we can price for it the right way, and he understands that that's how we build our entire risk model. So the way I've approached that is to say, once I have evidence that I have these crucial skills, can I badge people? And we've pretty much come up with a credentialing internally to my company that says, when I see the leadership, the communication, the talent, the data, the problem solving and innovation skills, I can badge those people so that I can move them in the company easily. So, I've created my own set of internal currency credentialing for that. The issue is that it's only behind my firewall. And that's probably what needs to change, and I think there's where the gap exists to some extent.
So let's pick up on that. So Mark's describing creating a new form of or culture of recognition within the Hartford to surface skills that may have been developed by people on the job. Mary, I'm wondering if we can turn to you and think about how are you innovating the product of education to be able to reach companies like Mark's and others to produce a product that you are sure is meeting their needs, to either complement what they're doing or to give them a head start in building a new workforce?
That's a great question because, and as I think about what you've talked about, Mark, we do, I'm at a university, so I'm one of the additional different team members here. And our university works really closely with corporations on customizing programs. So one of the things that we look at is what kind of learning is going on in the corporation or in another space, because by no means at Bellevue University do I believe that we have the lock on all learning at the post-secondary level. I know it happens elsewhere, and I want to be able to help Mark's team integrate that, if they so wish, into a bachelor's degree. So at Bellevue, that would be the real liquidity, that it's actually liquid between our two organizations. What we do now is more limited, and I think that's where there's opportunity. I'm doing kind of both a push and a pull. So on the push side, I'm pushing badges out to our students who go through whatever learning. It might be a major or it might be a degree, because we actually push the micro-credential, well, it looks like a micro-credential out for social learning of their diploma. But students nowadays use those to explain to employers or to explain to others what they've been doing, how they've invested in themselves, how that might translate into value for a corporation. So on the push side of the badge, it's going from the university. As an employer on the pull side, we employ a lot of part-time faculty. And I'm going to trust that there's not too many Department of Education people in the room, but we're really under a lot of scrutiny about who's teaching our classes, what kinds of credentials do they have. And when you're talking hundreds of part-time faculty and full-time faculty, trying to go through individual transcripts to figure out where are their credentials that we might badge internally or externally would be great. So the liquidity would come with my being able to recognize the education and learning at Hartford and apply that to a degree, and as well understanding how their employees might be able to help teach courses at our university. So push-pull.
So Mary, you raise an interesting point. One of the things that I used to hear over the last few years, or earlier on in our journey, was if an educational institution creates a digital badge, will an employer care about it? Now we're hearing you say, if an employer creates a digital badge or an outcome, will we care about it? Will we accept it? Ted, you've worn many hats in this space, and I know when we polled for any of our Department of Ed colleagues, you did one of these for a second. But can you,
PTSD.
PTSD. What's ACE's new view on this, or view on this in general?
Yeah, so let me take two cracks at it. One, to talk about where we just were, where Mary and Mark were. ACE for about 70 years has tried to operate as an exchange agent between the experiences that someone would get at the Hartford and the badge that they would get and the college credit process. So we evaluate corporate training and we assign academic value to it. So that's the exchange part. We assign academic value, and then we work with our partner institutions to give that credit, to make sure that that credit lives as they move through their degree program, their certificate program, or their credential program. We do that for military experiences as well. So this is it is a craft that's pretty well known and understood, and we want to do more. We want to do more of it. At the same time, more radically, I think that we work with our members, 2-year members, 4-year, public, private, for-profit, not-for-profit, and everybody across those sectors is really looking for ways to do things differently, to be able to identify not just a degree or a program, but as proxies for what people learn, but to actually dig beneath that and ask, what are the skills, what's the knowledge, what are the competencies that people are developing along the way. Pam and I had a good conversation before we started today about learning objectives, and developing learning objectives has become a part of the faculty role, and it's real and it's legitimate. So we're beginning to get an insight into not just what an economics major might know, but where critical thinking appears in the portfolio of work, where the kinds of analytic skills, Mark, that you were talking about, where they appear as learning objectives. And so I think we're in the process, a very exciting moment of disaggregating that at the institutional level. Elon College, to leave you with just one example, Elon College has now gone through its entire curriculum and has decoded the skills and competencies that are embedded in each of the courses. Mary is doing the same thing. So I think that we're gradually finding a middle ground between the world of work and the world of higher education.
Let's take that decoder word, that decoder ring, for example. Pam, you do operate in that space as well. First of all, maybe just a brief explanation of the work that you do, and what are you seeing that's different today than perhaps in the last few years? Because you've been at this, the team's been at this for a while. Is this a special moment for the work that you do?
I think it is. We are a translator also, in that unlike ACE though, where they're translating an entire training program or a badge program like Mark talked about, we are trying to translate the knowledge and abilities of an individual learner who got it from a whole variety of places and translate that into a college credit equivalency that is acceptable to a college as equivalent to particular courses. And what we find that's happening now that was not true even 5 years ago is that colleges are recognizing that they have to do more with learning outcomes, even if they are not, quote, competency based, even if they don't move wholly into a competence framework. They are recognizing that just listing courses and descriptions the way they've done for decades is no longer workable, and that if you're going to assess a person's learning that came from somewhere else, whether it's the Hartford or it's the auto dealer down the street, they have to be able to understand what is my learning equivalent to? What is the learning outcome in course A, B, or C? And how can I write something or demonstrate something that will fit that particular course? I think the difficulty in the translation, though, is that usually the learning from experience or from you learned online on the internet or you learned at work, that learning does not usually fit the box of a course. It's kind of a messy picture. A lot of it might be inside a course, and then there may be additional learning beyond it. And so what would be useful would be if institutions could break their courses into smaller modules that would allow a person to say, I know 2/3 of what's in Marketing 101, but I don't have the other third. However, I do have knowledge in another course nearby, and I need a credit for that. So that somebody could actually make progress toward a credential, a larger credential like a degree or certification, without having to repeat learning they already have. And right now, there are very few institutions that allow that.
I'm picturing an old game of Tetris, where as you kind of connect the matching parts, those pieces fall away, and you're just left with the parts that you actually need to achieve. Question for you, Chris. You have been here at GSV taking in the whirlwind of the ecosystem here. You're all calm and collected. We have a 200-year-old organization, a 100-year-old organization represented. You're a 140-year-old nonprofit in the UK. Yep. You've been involved in connecting skills, helping develop skills to connect people to jobs. What's your take on this, and are there some lessons or differences between what's going on in the UK around skills liquidity that we can borrow?
Yeah, thank you. It's been interesting here the last 2-3 days. I mean, just context, my organization, as Jonathan said, 140 years old. We design the curriculum that will be delivered across community colleges, schools, and into some universities. We also set the assessment strategies, we manage the overall assessment process, and we'll certificate the individual at the end of their learning program. We certificate around about 2.5 million people a year. I suppose one of the things I'm struck by, and interesting in the debate, that Jonathan was in just a moment ago, was the constant sense of, how can we ensure that this has got quality wrapped around it? What's the quality assurance model of this particular type of learning outcome? Is it reliable? Is it valid? Is it transparent? Can I actually look at what someone had studied at one college in one state to another college in another state, but they both seem to claim they've come out qualified in the same way? And I think that's an interesting challenge, and I think it's a challenge that credentialing can help solve. I suppose as I look at it from the UK point of view, I mean, one of the things we're fortunate in that we have an anchor, we have a qualification framework that operates nationally. It operates across academic and vocational curriculum. It operates across both what happens in an institution, but also in the place of work. It operates across both learning that's happening today and learning that may well already have happened. It looks at knowledge, behavior, skills. It looks at performance and can link that directly to clear outcomes. And it operates at levels that is understood by everyone. The learner understands the level that they're operating at or the level they're achieving. The employer recognizes that level. The education institution recognizes that level. And that framework also allows individual to move between pathways. If I want to start off on a vocational pathway, I can take that learning and easily translate and move across into an academic pathway. It's quite common and happens a lot through college and university. And so the benefits that come out of that is something that does give you consistency, it does give you equivalency, it does give you transparency. But in and of itself, what it ends up with is still a certificate, and the opportunity that I'm excited about is how we then take that framework but almost supercharge it with the additional opportunity that credentialing brings. How do we make even more visible the skills and experience that are often invisible? But we can do that still, though, based on an underpinning, rigorous assessment model that actually our whole system understands, domestically and increasingly internationally.
Let's dig into that notion of assessment some more. It's hard to talk about the liquidity of skills and getting to a more granular level of communication between education and employment without tapping into our metaphor of currency. We have to talk about what is this currency backed by? Our bills and our currency is backed by the full faith and credit of the institution that issued it. What does the full faith and credit mean for when it comes to assessments? How is assessment changing to be able to back up these perhaps smaller, more granular levels of achievement? Any of you have some examples of either good promise in new forms of assessment?
I think I'm going to speak to a little bit. One of them is the ability to rely on organizations like ACE and like CAEL, because that gives us at least a quality standard. It's a systematic appraisal of what is in learning, whichever one of you has articulated it. Excuse me. But it really does, on the whole, leave institutions at a number of different inputs trying to come up with a common way to evaluate that set, even an international degree or an international certificate. And we've all seen examples of where professionals from other countries come to the US and their credentials are not accepted in the US. So it can go all the way up to PhD or MD or architect level, and then all the way down to sets of certificates and qualifications. So I think that there has to be some kind of agreement on what those standards are going to be for it to be truly liquid.
Both for Mark and Chris, when you think about the levels, for example, Chris, are the kinds of assessments that are expected to have taken place consistent across levels, across different fields? What is the rubric, if you will, when it comes to assessments that create that ability for everyone to understand what a level means?
Yeah, so if I take, well, let's take apprenticeships. So the UK system now is moving to a model where at the end of an apprenticeship, whether that's a 2, 3, 4-year program, there is now an endpoint assessment, a significant scale summative assessment can be, undertaken over the course of 2 days. Looking at everything of knowledge, behavior, skills, the degree to which they've been applied, the degree to which they've been performed, the explicitity around the outcomes. And within that, there is a very clear differentiation of if I'm assessing a skill in engineering versus I'm assessing a skill in leadership and management. But nonetheless, what sits behind that is that everyone can understand that in order to achieve a level 6 apprenticeship, which would be a degree level apprenticeship, a certain level of academic achievement must have been demonstrated, a certain level of competence must have been demonstrated, and it's been demonstrated at the required level for someone to be deemed competent in that particular sector. So, again, if I'm recruiting someone who's saying I'm coming in, I've got a degree apprenticeship and I've done that in engineering, or someone says to me, well, I've got my degree from Oxford and it happens to be in sort of bioscience, I can still look at those two things and say, okay, whilst what they've studied is different, what their outcomes are may be different, but they're still going to be comparable in terms of overall level of achievement. And that is really important, and it's particularly important in the UK, where apprenticeships now are displacing graduate recruits at a significant rate. Part of that is to do with the introduction of a levy, but it's more fundamental to do with the fact that businesses believe apprentices are going to deliver a better economic return to them more quickly and are going to be more loyal to them as well. So, there's quite an interesting period here where we're looking at what does that therefore mean for assessment, and what does that therefore mean in terms of how we think about credentialing people and what we build around that too.
Yeah, go ahead, Ted.
So, Mark, did you want to jump in?
The only thing I could add to that is, we have over 100 badges internally in my organization. And we even have a governance group that makes sure that there's equality between those badges. And, really for us, it's just all about behavioral evidence. Even when somebody tries to invent a new badge, they'll put it in front of the governance group. And if they have too much of a learning element and maybe even an assessment element without any behavior, we reject the badge. So for me, if I'm going to badge somebody, I want to be certain that I'm getting the behavior I want that helps me grow my business.
Yeah.
And I hope that can equate.
And Mark, are those badges at this point anyway translated with any of your educational partners into formal credentials at an institution if someone wants them?
So, Chris mentions apprenticeships. So, again, going down the same path, Hartford, 200 years old, but one of the first insurers to try apprenticeships in the insurance industry. And as soon as I whipped out my badges, to the educational institution, they were like, oh, we like those, but you got to tell us what they mean. And once we started talking about the behavioral evidence piece of it, it's like, okay, if you and your apprenticeship can give them those behaviors, we can ensure they're ready for those. And that's how it helped us translate pretty well in the apprenticeship. I don't know if I could do that the same way with a 4-year degree, that I'm expecting that walking through the door. But the apprenticeship, it was easier.
So just can I pick up on that point about behaviours? So behaviours are a fundamental part of the apprenticeship sort of system in the UK. Part of the new frameworks that we're adopting is that the apprentice must actually spend time out into some form of community outreach program. 20% of what they do to establish the apprenticeship must be off-the-job training, off-the-job learning. And that is a great example where actually you are looking at behaviors, and it's exactly where we're beginning to think about using credentialing, because the richness of evidence on a community-based program is going to be fundamentally different. So whether that's sort of video, whether that's other sort of testimonials, other forms of assessment, which may well be how well has this individual led this community initiative, provides a richness that you'd never ever have had through some form of written test that's trying to understand how you'll behave in a particular situation. And that is being enormously valued by all parties.
So coming up a level, I think that, and you asked about sort of challenges to, I think assessment really, Chris, you introduced this, I think it's the name of the game, and it's what we have to do both with individual badges and courses, to use the traditional label. We need to be able to do that. We need to be able to assure quality across disparate providers, especially in an era in which there are more and more providers, not just established businesses, not just established higher education institutions, but organizations that are forming around skills training. So I think it's work that needs to be done. We don't start from zero. Chris's experience is really important. All of the industrial certifications that we have across the world, I think, give us a pretty good roadmap for how to assess the mastery of skills and abilities in certain of those intellectual domains, and we're learning from that. The new technologies, new learning science are giving us better adaptive curricula that can actually do the assessments while students are learning rather than having to step back in a summative way. And I guess I would go back to this last part of the conversation and say there are fundamentally, I think, two ways to think about assessment. One is individual-based, and that's where the behavioral work becomes so important. And Pam, that's where your work, the portfolio is nothing if it's not you prove to us that you have mastered it. So that's one vector. The second vector is a content stream. Right? What is it that a field describes as the essential sets of knowledge and skills that could be rated, for example, at the a 1 to 6 level, so that people are continuing to move up that ladder as they go through, whether it's a degree program, a certificate program, or learning that they're getting elsewhere. But I think that those are the two main ways that we should think about it.
One of the kind of different angle thoughts I have about this is when we look at where the future of degrees and education and disaggregation and all are going, I think certainly for Bellevue University, we're an open access adult learner institution, and not respecting the path that the students have already taken is going to become increasingly problematic, as well as the fact that if employers are supporting the employee through education, they don't want to have to pay again for some learning or some content or skills that students already have or their employees. I look at this as potentially, as we're thinking about degree pathing for adult learners, maybe not the 18 to 22-year-old, although I don't know, and thinking about lifelong learning and kind of just-in-time learning over time, I think we're going to have to tackle this issue of credential liquidity, or we're going to be spending a lot of overhead and a lot of individual time at each institution trying to help students ultimately earn a degree, and that's wasteful for everyone.
I think that is you're singing my song. Oh. So I really believe that this is true. But when I look at the typical higher education institution, not the Bellevues of the world, or the APUSs or the University of Maryland University College, but just the average institution with an adult school or an adult program, there is a mountain to move in order to get to this point of view and to actually see it played out in day-to-day life of faculty and administrators and the adult students they're trying to serve. Courses are not developed into learning outcomes statements in the ways that we know they should be. Assessments are not that sophisticated. They're the test I give for my course. That's how I know if someone knows it. They're not none of this is as well developed within traditional higher education as needs to be if we're going to really tackle these issues at a scale. And I think that's the issue. We've got the leaders, the pioneers, the outliers. We don't have a huge movement behind them of institutions, at least in my view, that are moving in this direction rapidly enough that the opportunities are truly there for the collaborations that Mark and others are talking about.
Go ahead, Ted.
So Pam and I come at this from slightly different points of view. I'm more optimistic than Pam is about the energy and the ability of institutions to, among other things, make partnerships that they've never made before. That it's not just Mary at Bellevue, but it's institutions across the country that are working more closely with employers. Community colleges are leading the way in this, traditional community colleges who are partnering with local employers to ask what are the skills and competencies that you need. Will you help us build a program that meets those needs? And kind of the ultimate assessment at the end, are the students we're producing doing the job that you signed us up to do? I think that is becoming a much more familiar routine, not only at community colleges, but with many of our four-year partners as well.
So let's touch back on that notion of scale and how we're hearing examples of, Mark was talking about relationships with some two-year institutions to try to create pathways and apprenticeships. We have talked a little bit with Pam around portfolio review, so an individual can make an attempt despite all the obstacles in their way to try to get credit articulated for that life experience. At ACE, ACE recently received a grant from the Lumina Foundation to try to bring a level of competency, a competency filter, if you will, to the review that they do of workforce training to make it easier for that workforce training to be transferred or articulated, make it easier for those faculty members and committees to understand what's in there. But ACE is also trying to bring some robots to the scene, some algorithms to see what can we do to allow technology to better scale up the filtering of that workforce training into sets of competencies that can be more easily translated into academic or even to other jobs. What are some of the signs that you see in your own work or in the field at large that suggest that this Rosetta Stone that each of us is struggling to articulate and to build and to grow is there a one-size-fits-all solution? Are these ultimately going to be bespoke marketplaces with employers and educational institutions getting together and figuring out what they need locally? What are the signs of big systemic change on this front?
As I said in an earlier panel discussion, I mean, I think that, we're certainly seeing it. We're seeing a system in the UK that is becoming highly employer-led, to the extent that the funding models are changing in order to ensure this is an employer-led system. Why? Because it is the employers who are demanding much more from the system as a whole. In turn, and we're working with a large hotel group, not dissimilar to the one we're sitting in here, there's actually looking at the issue of we have a highly mobile workforce. We need to ensure that we've got the consistency and quality of staff training. We need to make sure that if we're taking people from Asia into the US or the US into the UK and the UK into Europe, how do we know that they've all actually attained the same level of competence that we want them to have? So I think the employers are going to lead this. The World Association of Chefs Society, an organization that supports CPD for chefs, one of the most mobile workforces in the world. That's using credentialing in order to facilitate that mobility. So I think it's going to be driven by employers, first and foremost. And I think it's up to everyone else in the system to step up to that and recognize what it is we have to do to deliver them the validity and the reliability and the consistency which they're looking for in a credential or in a piece of learning.
Jonathan, I'm an economist, so I always think it's going to boil down to the market and the money. And the plain and simple truth of it is the market's going to keep pushing, because every time I'm working with an employer, they want recognition for their learning, and they're going to keep pushing the colleges on it. The other thing that we hear constantly is the cost of education, the return on investment in education. And so the two factors I think are going to start pushing on institutions and organizations to move that way. And they're going to reward the ones who get it. I really believe that's how, we see it out there every day. We had 2 colleges closed down in Nebraska in the last 2 years. And there's more at risk. And I think that people, money and market are going to drive these, but that's my economist coming out.
But I think, and I don't disagree at all, also having trained as an economist. I think the other part that I would add to it is that there is a market dynamic among the students. And so I think that as the U.S. higher education market begins to differentiate around the ability to promote learning that is also makes students job ready, those institutions will receive the benefit of market attention from not just employers but students, and I think that will be a helpful trend.
You know, where I also see movement is among policymakers at the state level, because with this huge push toward completion and the fact that we have 80 million people in the country with no college, and people are concerned about post-secondary skills for the world of employment, needing some level of post-secondary knowledge and skill. There seems to be movement on the policy front, not federally, but too much, but at the state level, to try to foster these very partnerships that we're talking about, taking a more active role in this arena than I have seen before. So that part of it feels very encouraging to me. And I would like to see the same movement at the federal level.
So there's some organizations have begun to take the bachelor's degree off of the job description. At Credly, we have taken the number of years experience off of skills off the job description. Rather than say, must have 5 years in digital marketing, we ask people who are filling a position at Credly to list the specific skills you would hope someone who had 5 years of digital marketing experience would bring to the table. Mark, when you think about hiring new talent into the Hartford, are you at the point yet where you are looking for better, more detailed signals of skills? Could you yourself see taking a bachelor's degree off the job description?
So you're hitting home for me in a way. When I was preparing for this panel, who's gotten to the age where you take the year of your college off your resume? And I did, and when I was preparing for this panel and we were talking about the credentialing aspects, I said, that looks really lame when it comes to what you're good at and what your education was. I have a bunch of wonderful experiences below the line that I can detail with every job I had. But what I did, after being on the phone for an hour, was I went out and I took all my credentials that I've earned at the Hartford and added them, to that education section. And one of the battles I'm having now with my HR organization is the transparency of these credentials. They're okay with everybody showing these internally, but as soon as you start talking about, hey, can they put them on LinkedIn and stuff like that? So, after I did that, I did have a discussion with HR, and I said, okay, look at my resume with my undated bachelor's of science. And I did a lot of nice things in my career. But now look at it when I put all those credentials on there, and I put my advanced communication and my advanced data and my patent granted and my inventor badge. How does that make you look at my lifelong learning in a different way? And when people talk about credentialing, they have to think of it in that framework.
It's actually really refreshing to hear you make it personal, because a lot of us, myself included, when we talk about systemic change and what we're trying to do, we somehow remove ourselves as a potential beneficiary of the work we're all trying to do. I think that's a really important perspective for you to have shared with us.
So I want to pick up on Mark's. So great story, and I think that what you did is an unalloyed good for you, for anybody who's going to look at your credential. I think
It was
creates
more for HR to say, do you agree with me?
Yeah, well, let me dress it up a little bit. I think it's an aspiration, and it's an aspiration for companies. It should be an aspiration for institutions to be able to get below that proxy, below that label, to really talk about this stuff, and having occasions to certify that learning. Your badges, for example, I think is really important. And I think that, Jonathan, you asked a question about assessment earlier. I think that the US model is more likely to be a model that has a variety of different ways in which institutions aim to prove the outcomes that they advertise. And that there will need to be a sort of a quality assurance layer on top of that assures that there is comparability across the different providers. And I think that will open the door to more providers who will prove their stuff on the basis of outcomes rather than on the basis of inputs.
I mean, it's interesting, Jonathan. I mean, you know, our organisation, you know, and we work from Chicago through to Wellington in New Zealand as a group. So we've removed qualifications as a requirement for any job application, first and foremost. Anyone that's coming into our organisation now through interview will go through a preferences interview, because we're looking for preferences, behaviour, attitude, aptitude, as much as we are skill. We will credential everyone who comes for an interview. So even if they fail to get a job, they will still get credentialed that they have achieved something in that process. All of our staff development now is built around a credential framework, and that's designed specifically so we can help our own staff understand where and how do they progress in our organisation, what skills are transferable across which disciplines in the organisation. And it's, for me, you know, it's created a very different dynamic in the organisation around how people want to learn and how they want to evidence what they've learnt or what they've achieved elsewhere. I mean, I've learnt more about my staff in the last 6 months as we've gone through this exercise of, wow, I never knew you could do that. Why didn't you tell us that before? I can use you over here. So the mobility of staff across the organisation is exponentially increasing, which I think is really exciting and a great way for us to be able to evidence credentialing at work as we go out trying to sort of, you know, tell the story more in the markets which we operate.
Great example. I understand that at City and Guilds internally, you took inputs, job descriptions, put them into a big robot box and spit out a set of skills and competencies that the group actually valued in order to establish what your achievement system
Absolutely.
should look like.
Across the whole organisation, every job description, every job advert over the course of the last 24 months, and that drove out a very clear set of competencies that we value the most, regardless of job or role or geography. And that's become a common framework for us. It's been a very simple exercise. It wasn't that hard to do.
It's amazing how much self-reflection comes from going through these exercises of thinking about what you want to project as what your organization values. And once you decide that, putting yourself in that lens and saying, how would I square up and level up in this system? When you hear this, go ahead, Mary.
You know, I think of another aspect of that, and that is our new student population is totally uses social media. They really don't care about you coming into their office and seeing their diploma framed on the wall, but they do care about their persona on social media. They're proud of the companies that they work for. So our badging around Hartford, it not only allows them to express themselves in the way they think about expressing themselves, it's good for the organization, it's good for the universities as well, because you get a much stronger brand, it's more viral, it's more real, and that's plainly how they think about who they are and what represents them. It's all visual. So badges, we've given out about 4,000. 78% of them are on LinkedIn right now. That's how strong, and then there's some on Facebook and some on Instagram, but that's how they push their diploma, they push their major, they push their learning.
You know, all that said, and I think that's very exciting. When I think of the average adult learner that comes through our Learning Counts portfolio assessment process, they want a degree. They still want the traditional recognition of their knowledge and ability, because that is still the currency. It is still the proxy that we're using in our country in general for knowledge and skill, while all these innovations are occurring on the margins. And that's great, and I think that they point the way to the future. But I think we have to recognize at the same time that we're saying you may not need this, maybe you just need to demonstrate competency, but they need it. They feel they need it. And so they need to go through some assessment that will recognize their ability and allow them the portability that degrees still allow in our country. So I think while we need these parallel paths of this increase in badging, apprenticeship, these other areas of currency, but we have got to remember that we still have millions of people who want a traditional credential.
Ted, when you talk to college presidents and visit universities in both your current role as president of ACE and when you were at the department and when you were college president yourself, what are when you think about the product of higher education, you can pick any time frame you want. You can pick 5 years, you can pick 50 years, but in your crystal ball, based on trends you're seeing, will the product suite of higher ed be significantly different in whatever time frame you've selected?
I thought you were going to say I could go back to 1650. There will be places where there will be, as there has been in the history of higher education, of a sharpening of focus on different disciplines, different sets of skills, different sets of abilities. And I think that that's natural and that's normal. I think what's going to change more than that mix is going to be the way higher education institutions articulate what students have learned in their programs. So I think about the traditional degree, and we've used the word proxies a lot, and I think it's right. So there are assumptions that are made, or at least were made, by employers, by graduate schools, by family and peers about what that degree meant. What were the skills underneath it? So we've always had a picture in our head of what an economics degree means. But we've never been clear about articulating it in a way that could make that economics degree something that you could double click on, and then down below that would be the 15 badges that went along with my economics degree. Now Mary's smarter than me, so she would have 27 badges under her economics degree, but the conversation then will I think change as we get sharper and clearer about articulating the learning objectives, the learning outcomes, and then perhaps at an institution level, the longer term life outcomes for students.
That's a great point. It sounds like one common theme that's been universal to this entire conversation is that every group, whether it's an employer like the Hartford serving its customers and its own team, or City and Guilds, which is helping to broker relationships between skilled trades and people with skills, and across the whole panel is this idea of it's not an either or, right? We're talking about a culture of recognition, of achievement. We have the technology and the tools to actually create more visible outcomes, whether it's more visible outcomes in the context of a bachelor's degree or any other degree program, just making the outcomes more apparent, or creating alternative paths. Most people who complete a degree will not have completed it between 18 and 22. So not having a bachelor's degree cannot mean that one would never get one. It might be that you're on a path towards one, right? So just as we close out here, I'm wondering if someone wants to share an optimistic thought about what a world looks like in which the denomination of currency includes each individual skill right up to and beyond these degrees we're talking about. What's the most optimistic vision someone can paint for us a few years into the future?
That we're able to accommodate the individual paths and the diversity and the variety and the options, because every student we have, and it's true across the board, comes at it from different experiences with different goals and different outcomes. And I do think it's that richness that will create the strength of the system.
I think I'd add to that. I mean, it's for me, I'd like to think that whatever institution someone is looking to work for or progress in, that institution sees the whole person. And actually, the opportunity of credentialing is to make, as I said earlier, the invisible visible. And that brings both what you've achieved academically, what you've achieved in the context of work, what you've achieved in the context of outside of work, because you can credential a hell of a lot outside of work too. And those three things, I think, make for a much richer individual and a much more sort of enlightened workforce and employer as well.
Great.
What would be really an optimistic picture for me too would be that the funding models are restructured such that these things are possible and encouraged, rather than done in spite of the system in which most of us are operating, and that policy enables it and funding enables this change.
Recognized learning is able to be bundled and packaged in a variety of different ways, and it's a lifelong process with a number of different off-ramps, some of which may be degrees, some of which may be certificates.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks,
for a great
everybody.
panel.